Joining us now from Washington, a man who is very difficult to book.
Oh, he is. It's impossible.
I'm serious.
I can't believe you got him.
Get him on this show.
How did you do it?
At least I couldn't book him.
The EU has to step forward and not just offer slogans and long-range invitations. It has to offer some cash. Because Ukraine is on the brink of economic collapse, literally. The issue goes beyond Ukraine. It goes to the heart of the issue. What will Russia become over the next decade or so? We have simultaneously three problems in our relations with Russia, all of which are serious and dangerous, and which can best be solved by compromise.
Is my dad coming on today? No. He turned us down.
No, he's too busy. He says he's too busy. He's doing too many shows, and he doesn't want to dilute, the strength of his words. I'm kind of hurt. Mika.
Here with us now.
Oh, he's here!
Thank God.
It's like Santa Claus.
I know.
He's here.
Former National Security Advisor for President Carter and author of the book Strategic Vision, America and the Crisis of Global Power, Dr. Zbigniew Brzezinski.
He has a very busy dance card.
Well, he does.
A lot of people
I'm
pulling
sorry,
so
I
you need to be,
get in line, I guess.
You need to be a little more understanding.
Well, good thing
Was
Ian
Mika
was
always
available.
impatient, Dr. Brzezinski, growing up? Did she like kick and scream, say, I want it and I want it now?
I'm sorry, you're talking to me?
Yeah.
What was the question?
Joe wants to know if I was impatient as a child.
Totally. You remind me in terms of personality of someone that we nowadays in our household call Daisy.
Comparing you to the dog.
No, that dog's bad.
Well,
very cute, very charming, a bit unpredictable.
all right. So
I won't go into details.
Oh, good. Let's not, actually. Let's talk about Ukraine. Thanks, Dad. I'm sort of diminished now, but I'll try and do this.
Only to the level of a dog. Go ahead.
Let's just talk about Vladimir Putin and some of the recent developments over the past 24 to 48 hours, it seems to me, since the Olympics ended, where he's making some moves that seem to counter the warnings that Secretary of State John Kerry is putting forward and our Vice President.
I have the sense that there is some confusion in Moscow on how to react to the Ukrainian problem. And I imagine there's probably a lot of disagreement among the top leaders. And Putin may be showing himself to be more clumsy than we would have assumed. In any case, I think something is fundamentally involved here, and I think it has to be said. If Russia plays it roughly, if Russia does some really extreme things, such as, for example, seizure of Crimea, then Russia may end up having Crimea, but will forever lose Ukraine. Because the Ukrainian people are very territorial. They have a sense of their land, and they will never forgive Russia for this. And of course, there could be even some sort of a military collision if the Russians went too far. And here I want to mention something which I'm doing just from memory, and it's worth checking. But I believe that in 1994, 4 years after the breakup of the Soviet Union, the joint American-Russian effort to denuclearize Ukraine, to remove nuclear weapons from Ukraine, was completed. And on that occasion, a treaty was signed between the United States, the Russian Federation, Great Britain, a nuclear power, France, a nuclear power, guaranteeing the territorial security and integrity of Ukraine. Now, this could be also involved here because that means that these powers are now committed. So I hope that common sense will prevail in Moscow, and we can have a deal whereby the West helps Ukraine, the Russians help Ukraine, and Ukraine preserves its independence and moves gradually towards Europe.
Gene Robinson.
Dr. Brzezinski, what, if anything, should be offered to or done for the Russian speakers in Crimea and in the eastern part of Ukraine who are not all that thrilled about the idea of a more definitive break with Russia?
Well, first of all, they have their own rights, and they're obviously asserting them. But secondly, it isn't just that there are Russians in some parts of Ukraine, although that tends to be exaggerated. Not every Russian-speaking Ukrainian is a Russian, just as every speaking Belgian is not a Frenchman. So, first of all, there's that. Secondly, in Russia, which has about 145 million people, there are about 20 million people who are not Russians. So what about their rights? I think Ukraine is a state that has existed in these current frontiers for a number of years, and there is no persecution of the Russians, either in Crimea or in Ukraine itself. I think if the situation settles down and calms down, I think the people can cohabit, work together, and basically Ukraine remains an integral state, secure, and in its own territorial limits.
Thomas Roberts.
Dr. Brzezinski, you wrote in an op-ed for the Financial Times, I want to read in part, and it was titled, "Russia Needs a Finland Option for Ukraine. The U.S. could and should convey clearly to Mr. Putin that it is prepared to use its influence to make certain a truly independent and territorially undivided Ukraine will pursue policies towards Russia similar to those so effectively practiced by Finland. Mutually respectful neighbors with wide-ranging economic relations with Russia and the EU, no participation in any military alliance, viewed by Moscow as directed at itself but expanding its European connectivity. In brief, the Finnish model is ideal for Ukraine, the EU, and Russia in any larger East-West strategic accommodation." Sir, when we talk specifically, though, and pull back the layers, you had talked about earlier, money. If we follow the money, who is going to be most supportive to Ukraine? And is that where the loyalty is then going to remain, with the EU, with the West, or with Russia?
Well, I think there are four sources of money for Ukraine at this stage. One is the international community, and the United States can be very active in that, the World Bank, IMF, and so forth, and the United States itself. Secondly, the EU, which has a stake, obviously, in a stable, non-threatening process of Ukraine moving westward, but very gradually and slowly. And then there is third, the Russians themselves, Russia. After all, it's in Russia's interest to have a good relationship with Ukraine, and not only in Ukraine's interest. So the Russians should obviously maintain a position of accommodation and working with the Ukrainians, and some parts of Ukraine are heavily economically dependent on Russia. And the Russians need Ukraine as well. And last but not least, there are the oligarchs in Ukraine who have stolen like crazy a lot of money because of the corruption. Look at Yanukovych's palaces. They're worth billions. I think they should be forced to kick in. They should also, and they have their money in London. I hope the English don't take advantage of that and let that money go to Ukraine, because that could in itself immediately contribute a lot of cash.
Dad, David Gregory has a question for you. David?
Good morning, Dr. Brzezinski.
Good morning.
My question is, what are the stakes here for America and Ukraine? And more broadly, how would you advise this president to take on an increasingly incorrigible Vladimir Putin?
Well, I think, first of all, what was just read out in the quotation from me in Financial Times, I think strategically makes sense. I think we have to be patient, persistent, but also very clear. We want an accommodation about Ukraine, but it cannot be an accommodation that's dictated by threats of force. Basically, I think Putin would like to subordinate Ukraine to Russia, and on that basis try to recreate what he calls the Eurasian Union, which is another name for the Soviet Union or the Russian Empire. But he has to understand that's past history. That's not going to be recreated. Nobody wants to be in it, and particularly now the Ukrainians. Yeah. At the same time, we can say to the Russians, look, it's neither in your interest nor in our interest to reignite the Cold War. We're prepared to work with you. We're trying to stabilize Ukraine. We're not trying to turn it against you. Work with us. Let's move forward. And in the long run, I think Russia itself, maybe after Putin, probably will want to move towards Europe. Especially if it glances eastward. And you know what I mean by that. There's somebody east of Russia that the Russians fundamentally fear, and from whom they took a lot of land.
John Howman?
Dr. Brzezinski, I just want to switch to, we've talked a lot about Ukraine, I want to switch to a different topic real quick, which is Afghanistan. The NATO defense ministers are getting ready for a full drawdown, to complete withdrawal from Afghanistan by the end of the year, even as there's a lot of discussion about the fact that if we continue on that path, a lot of the progress that's been made in Afghanistan is not sustainable. What do you think we're going to see over the course of the next 9 months as we head towards the zero option, as some people call it, in Afghanistan?
I think there is the real danger of a crisis in our relations with the Afghans. But ultimately it's their country and they have to think of its future. We have made a commitment with which we have stuck for more than 10 years now, trying to create a more modern Afghanistan. I personally feel that perhaps we were a little too ambitious in trying that. It might have been wiser just to stick to the military operation and see if some sort of a negotiated outcome could be reached somewhat earlier. But in any case, we are where we are. And I think if the Afghans are not prepared to sign a status of forces agreement and indicate what their view of the long-range relationship with us is, we might be better off leaving sooner rather than later. In any case, I'm reluctant to consider the deployment for a prolonged period of time of a small American military force, because that could be overrun if things go badly. So either we stay there with some respectable force in agreement with the Afghans, or we leave.
All right, Dr. Zbigniew Brzezinski, thank you. Thanks, Dad.
Nice to see you all.
Great to have you on the show finally.
Well, this was a big booking.
It was a big booking.
Huge get.
It's like,
I kind of feel like
this is really hard to do.
You think he might bring Daisy next time?
Everything is hard.
I want Daisy.
I'd like
Daisy.
to ask him to bring Daisy next time.
Well, especially if Daisy, he says Daisy reminds him of Mika, and
Listen,
we need to see why.
You're going to need a team of negotiators to accompany Daisy if she comes on this show.
I think Daisy is perfect,
No.
Dr. Brzezinski.
No.
I think she's perfect.
She looks sort of vicious.
Well,
no, she's not.
I mean, you're about to take a chunk out of that guy's leg.
You come on my property and you will meet Daisy. Okay, thank you, David Gregory, as well.
Thank you, guys.
David, what do you have on Sunday's Meet the Press?
Well, we'll be talking about these topics, but also the future of our military, the fight over the budget. What do we have to be prepared for in the future? Two key members of the Armed Services Committee talking about that.
Great. All right. Thank you, David.
Talking about Daisy, you think?
No. Coming up, we'll break down the race for Oscar Gold.
I salute the heroic people of Maidan. What you're doing is historically vital. It is the kind of action which dramatizes your national identity, your sense of commitment to your independence, and your faith in victory. You now have to translate that into an effective political tool. You have to demonstrate not only to the Ukrainian people, but to the world, that the desire for independence, the determination to be a free European state, to be at the same time friendly with Russia, is something that unites all of you, and that you have a leadership that symbolically reflects that historical commitment. This is why you have to create a committee of national unity, you have to have visible leadership, and you have to indicate to everyone concerned in Kiev, in Washington, in Berlin, in Moscow, that the new generation of Ukrainians are committed to an independent Ukraine that is part of Europe, part of a Europe of which Russia eventually becomes a part as well, and that you will not stop until that objective is achieved. And you have to have visible leadership to make that effective.